Hello, welcome to Graphic Policy Radio. This is your host, Ilana Levin, and this is a comics podcast. This is a podcast for comics fans who know that it takes no complications to dance to the rock and roll station, and it was all right. But that doesn't mean we still can't read a graphic novel about it. Today I'm joined by a cartoonist with a new graphic novel out called All Tomorrow's Parties, which is about the formation and dissolution of the Velvet Underground. To paraphrase Brian Eno, the Velvet Underground didn't sell many records, but everyone who bought one went out and started a band. And they're a band that's incredibly dear to me, and I'm so excited to see them be represented in a graphic novel form by a fellow fan. And I'm always excited to talk about the ways comics and music interact. So I'd like to welcome to the show Koren Shadmi.
Hi.
Hello, hello.
Hey, nice to be here.
Koren is an American-Israeli award-winning illustrator and cartoonist. He studied illustration from the School of Visual Arts in New York, where he now teaches. His books have been published internationally and include In the Flesh, The Abaddon, Highwaymen, Rise of the Dungeon Master, The Twilight Man, Rod Serling, and The Birth of Television, and most recently, Lugosi, The Rise and Fall of Hollywood's Dracula, which I read and was very good. I'll probably ask a couple questions about that as well today. He has contributed illustrations and comics to The New York Times, The New Yorker, The Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, Business Week, Playboy, Mother Jones, The Washington Post, Boston Globe, Wired, and many others. His illustration work has won several awards at the Society of Illustrators. So welcome to the show. I always want to just start off asking folks, how did you get into cartooning? Did you read a lot of comics as a kid? Were you artists of a different sort? Or how did you get into the medium?
I grew up in Israel and comics work there. There's no comics culture. Now there is a little bit more, but especially when I was growing up, there wasn't much of that. When you ask someone about comics, they would be like, oh, the thing inside Bazooka Joe, because the bubble gum in Israel was common. And those were the kind of comics that people knew about, which were, in retrospect, those are kind of awful too. But lucky enough to go to a class after school, class for comics with one of the few people in Israel that was making a living just for making comics. And he had a comic that ran in the popular teenage magazine that was kind of Israeli version of Archie. And I took his class for many years, and then I became his assistant pretty young when I was 14 or 15, and I started coloring his comics. And he had a great collection at home and in his studio, and he would let me borrow things. And he was mostly into superhero comics and more mainstream comics, but he had a lot of interesting stuff and education. That's what got me into it, and that's what got me started, and I haven't stopped since.
Oh, fabulous. And you open the graphic novel talking, it's at the end of the graphic novel. You talk a bit about how you got into the Velvet Underground as a band. I think it's so telling that basically everybody finds the Velvet Underground as a teenager. Nobody finds them as a child. And not as many people find them as an adult. But that's this moment where we all discovered the group. And I'd love to have you share some of that origin story with the Velvet Underground.
Yeah, my music taste was changing during my teenage years. And I think being a teenager in the 90s, I was really into grunge and the kind of music that was popular at the time. And it takes a while to find out that all those bands owe a lot to the Velvet Underground. I think one of the first records I bought, it was a CD. It was like the high point of CD period, but it was an REM CD, and REM were big followers of the Velvet Underground, and there was songs that I listened to that were Velvet Underground covers that I didn't even know were covers, and so it took a while. I was exposed to them late, and I think a lot of people can relate to being exposed to certain music, not in a chronological manner, but rather like digging back in time and going backwards. And everybody has his point where it stops. But for me, it was getting first into the bands that were maybe popular in the 90s and 80s, and then only later on finding out about the Velvets.
For me, it's also really aligned with comics because I literally bought, I was reading X-Men before this, but I literally bought the first issue of Sandman I ever bought from the same thrift store that I also bought Velvet Underground and Nico on tape, like possibly in the same shopping trip.
Nice. That's a good shopping trip.
Right? And I got a really good vintage shirt there that I still have held on to, even if it doesn't fit me. You hold on to these things. So what made you think about representing the band's story as a graphic novel?
I did 2 books, The Humanoids. The first was about Rod Serling, and the second one was about Bela Lugosi. And they asked me, what's next? And so I gave them, I believe, 2 or 3 options. And one of the options was the Velvet Underground. And I really wasn't sure if there was a full story there. I was just reading various accounts. I didn't do any kind of deep dive, but it really sounded like there was a good story there. So they told me, if that's what you want to do, go for it. And then I started doing the research and reading the books and realizing, yes, there definitely is a story here. This band was ahead of it. They came up with a kind of music that no one has heard before. The lyrics were ahead of the time. Everybody was singing in the 60s about free love, and the hippie movement was starting to form. And meanwhile, the Velvets are singing about scoring dope and all this type of stuff that no one really wanted to talk about in the media or anywhere. It was discussed. It was subject matters that were covered in books, and you see it in the graphic novel too. Lou Reed talk about some of his influences, and he studied under a guy who was a very famous poet, and he basically was exposed to a lot of these like mid-century gritty writers, and that was translated in time into music, and he wanted to bridge this idea, or kind of create a bridge between that literary mentality and pop music, which no one really did before. It was like everybody considered back then pop music to be this thing where you sang about love, or you sang about these surfing, or whatever subject matter was accessible and easy to digest. And he said, why? We can sing about anything. In poetry, you can write poems about anything. So why not try to bridge that gap? And
one of the things that is it's funny but sad to me is there's 2 moments in the book where you have Lou Reed and Frank Zappa be pissed at each other. And it's just so funny because it just reminds me of the Spider-Man pointing at himself meme, where this is the other person who's into that. Like, you guys who hate each other, like, you also hate the same people, and you also have so many of the same tendencies. But then the way it's expressed in the music and the different sense of humor and the cultural orientation of the Velvets being the ultimate New York band and Zappa being they're LA is, although certainly not Hollywood, means that they just do not understand each other. And yet there's so much in common, because that's the other artist who's actually, we're going to do bizarre, absurdist art that is seriously referencing and pulling from avant-garde music. And we really hate hippies. Like there's just so much in common. And it's funny that I hadn't really seen that so clearly until more recent years, because of, I guess, some of the aesthetics being so wildly different in the end. Yeah.
Yeah. Both Zappa and the Velvets, there were documentaries about them done recently, both excellent documentaries. The Velvets documentary was Todd Haynes, which was really great. Yeah, I forget who did the one about Zappa, but they both existed in the fringe. And the fact that Zappa became as successful as he was is a little bit of a fluke, or I wouldn't say a fluke, but it's surprising, because he was criticizing America. He was pointing out all the the things that were wrong and singing about things that were not sung about. But yeah, I guess they just rubbed each other the wrong way. And there's a lot of that with Lou Reed. He's just this very antagonistic person, and perhaps also Zappa to an extent.
Yes.
They're both these
It's so funny.
grumpy people. I forget if Zappa's, I don't think he's Jewish, is he? No. But
No, he's not. He's Italian.
Yeah, they're both these grouchy guys that are easily ticked off.
Yes, yes. And they definitely have some real content. Like there's the perfectionism and the improvisation and the contrast, and definitely disagreements over what are the proper drugs to use or not use at all. But yeah, it's interesting. This is a book that you created that has so many interesting snapshots from history, things that I, as a big nerd about this stuff, know, things that I hadn't really seen put together that way. I would really encourage folks who, if you're a fan of the band, whether quote unquote everything about them or you know nothing and are just curious, like this is definitely a book that you can get something from. And one of the things that I really thought about as I was looking at it was you're going through material that has so much visual reference to draw from because of how obsessively documented everything from the factory period was, but then so little from before that, right?
Yeah, there's a wealth of visual reference for certain things. Definitely the factory, since this was this hub of artists, and Warhol was always with the camera and always shooting things with on film, and also he had photographer friends that were there, so there was always someone documenting things. So there's a lot of that, but if you look before, there's really not a ton. Like there's no, like I wouldn't be able to find pictures of Pickwick Records or where Lou Reed started his recording career or things like that. But you make things up when they're not available to the best of your knowledge. And in general, there was a lot of visuals to draw from, which was great. But also it's a lot of work, because if I want to see how New York looked like in the 60s in a certain period of time, I have to comb through all these photos and find the right photos that fits the scene. So, and also just make sure everybody looks the way they should look. So visually, it may have been the most challenging book I've ever worked on.
Yeah, it's interesting to me also just because it's like it's this whole time period that's so mythologized, and everybody has really, who feels passionately about it, has a very specific idea of how everything should look and feel. It's a lot of pressure. So I've also just have to be like, okay, we're not going to have exactly the same take on everything, and that's fine. I think that, we're looking at history that has so many different voices and perspectives in it that you're not going to be able to get a single version of the story. So, which again, like I think that's one of the reasons why it's cool for a graphic novel, right? Like you very much center the story here very reasonably, really as a parallel story between Lou and John Cale in particular in the book. And one of the things that really struck me was how you even draw the way you cartoon them in the bulk of the book. Their faces are even opposites. Like your John Cale is extremely convex and Lou is very concave, and it's exaggerated in that way. And when I compare that sort of default cartooning of their faces to the way, and I love this decision when you have Warhol's screen tests in the book, and you have them drawn much more photorealistically to mimic the style of the photographs that mimic the style of the film that you're quoting. You're making choices in how you are characterizing people's faces when you're doing them in that more cartoon format. So I wasn't sure if that was a piece of, how you were developing them visually as characters.
Yeah, they have to be interesting to draw. You have to exaggerate a little bit, but you don't want it to be too exaggerated. You're picking the tone of your book. And if I drew Lou Reed with like big manga eyes and cartoony features, and John Cale with whatever exaggerated features, then it would send a different message. It would be like, this is a goofy, funny book, where it really isn't. But at the same time, I don't want it to be too serious. So I want it to be expressive. And so, I've pushed things a little bit, and my Lou Reed looks a little bit like Frankenstein at times, because there is something about his face that I think he even made allusions to that. He was very interested in I think in that in Frankenstein as just like this kind of big forehead that goes forward and eyes that are sunk deep in the face. And so yeah, that's always fun thing to do. And people have depicted, there's been a couple books, graphic novels about Andy Warhol already. So I tried to do my own Andy Warhol, but again, I didn't want him to look too goofy and cartoony, so I did my best to capture him. But he also he had a kind of a difficult face, I would say, to more difficult face to capture.
I can see that. I think you did a great job. I mean, I'm a big Warhol nerd as well, and I was really impressed with how you are able to capture his speech mannerisms without it being over the top, because it's way too easy to make it a cartoon. But then if you don't actually go there at all, it doesn't seem like him.
Yeah, he had a very interesting way of talking, and he was just like would rather have other people talk than him. And I think it was partially because he was very shy, and he wasn't a great speaker for sure. But there's something about, he's very enigmatic and very mysterious. And even there's a quote, I think I wrote into the book, where Lou Reed says, I usually am able to figure people out, and I could not crack the Andy Warhol's, what makes him tick, because he is so strange. And I come to think about it, if we're still talking about likenesses, I think the most difficult character to catch was actually Nico. And I think that's because really beautiful characters are harder to draw, because I don't know, there's something really, really, that was really difficult for me in capturing her. But I think at the end, what happened was that I tried to draw her face shape without hair, when I found there's some earlier photos of her with her hair lifted up. I was like, oh, that was there we go, that's the shape of her head. And once I figured out the shape of her head, then it's
so interesting, because I just think there's like a split between artists, cartoon comics artists, for like a big chunk of people cannot draw anybody who doesn't look like a fashion model. And the other half are like, I can't draw people who look too perfect, because this is the complications and nuance of faces that are more unusual is more attractive to me. And it's what I feel appeal to drawing. So it's interesting to see which line of that people fall on. And I think a lot of the folks who spend more time on superheroes.
Yeah, this is a really interesting
people who have specific and unique faces.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. It's something that I think about a lot, especially when I look at mainstream comics. I'm very turned off by the way that people draw faces, and it's very idealized. It doesn't even matter if it's superhero or just like your run-of-the-mill. I don't know. I can't give a good example, but it's just everybody's super handsome. The eyes are like really sparkly, and the women are just like you're saying, they're all just like supermodels. And it's just, this is not real life, and this is not how people look. And it's just, there's something a little bit, I don't know how to describe it, but almost like kissing up to the characters that you're drawing. And especially I think when you're dealing with nonfiction, these are real people. So you have to treat it with a level of realism. And at the same way that I'm not trying to build like some rosy picture of my subjects, I would also try to not draw them in some sort of like overly handsome way. Although a friend of mine said that the way I drew John Cale would make him very happy. So I don't know if that meant that I idealize him a little bit, but I don't know.
It's not wrong, but it's definitely one of the more flattering portrayals. But that's okay. Like, it's an aesthetic decision. But you're making these choices in interesting ways. Like, you have a scene where Paul Morrissey, who's filmmaker partner with Warhol, is like telling Lou, you have to bring on a chanteuse to sing with the band. And suddenly the perspective, like, Lou is tiny on the page, and he's not that small in any of the other frames. Like, you're telling a story with these illustrations in that way too. But yeah, like one of the real big things I've been really thinking about is like, here you've written a book about a band that you love, presumably featuring artists who you really love and respect. And it's by no means like hyper complimentary, particularly towards Lou. And we're in this time where I think people like want everyone to make a ruling on, is this a good person or a bad person? And if you like somebody's music, that means you're endorsing the entirety of who they are as a person and as an artist. And like this, your book is just, that's not what we're here to do.
Yeah, I think that's
So
exactly right. Yeah, this is something that I have these conversations often with my wife, because I feel like she subscribes more to that. People either good or bad, and if someone does something bad in their life, then it immediately labels them a bad person, and we shouldn't discuss them or we shouldn't deal with them. And I think people are complicated. Artists are a lot of times flawed and damaged individuals that are driven to art because of things that have happened to them in their past. We see with Lou Reed that Lou Reed comes from a very problematic background where his parents couldn't accept him for who he was. They tried to fix him and ended up causing him so much trauma and pain. So I think that, to me, I'm attracted to these characters that have very distinct ups and downs and could have very damning moments in their lives, but maybe are not necessarily evil people. So it's very complicated when you deal with that. And we just saw we saw Oppenheimer in the theater, and I think that was this is another character who's like very, and I'm not sure if he fully captured that, but he's just like a complicated character that it's not really clear if you can put him in the bracket of the bad people or the good people. And I think that does make it more interesting, where it's like, what drives a person to be like that? And you get that complexity when you're working from true stories, from like real people. You get that further depth and further complexity that's really hard to come up with when you're doing a fiction graphic novel, which I've done before. And it's you, if you want to get that depth, you have to base it on a real person.
Oh, that's interesting. One of the things I liked, as much as this is very much told as Lou and John's story, is you have a couple of really good moments with Mo Tucker in here, the drummer, who I feel like she's someone who is really undervalued when people talk about the band, and yet the band really it doesn't seem like the band undervalued her. And I appreciated getting those moments from her. Was a lot of that from her book or from other observations?
The book does focus more on Lou and John. So I tried my best to give little moments where, Sterling and Mo could shine a little bit. And I have to admit, I did not read like a biography dedicated specifically to her. But I feel like I started getting, sense of her personality. And she seemed to have been the glue holding the band a little bit, because she was the most stable one and they were all just like these really volatile people. And so I tried to put that in, that she was cool in her own way, and her kind of stability, or almost you make the comparison to her playing like a steady backbeat of music, added to them sticking for as long as they did, and which I think without her or with someone else, they may have broken up after the first album. So she was definitely a good influence. But yeah, the Lou Reed and John Cale are both these like really strong personalities. So it's very hard to compete when you have people that are really intense.
Yeah. And you frame the story in opening with the death of Warhol. I think you brought a really interesting perspective about Lou's searching for father figures and mentors throughout his career, and then his struggle with that.
Yeah, he had a not a great relationship with his father. He was more close with his mother, and his father was just like a working man that wanted him to be an accountant and have a steady job, and his dad really didn't get him. And I don't know what part of him going to electroshock treatment was the dad or the mom, but I feel like he blamed his father more. And then in college, he had a class with Delmore Schwartz, who was this famous poet, and all of a sudden he had this father figure who was this really intense, crazy writer, and someone who got him. And again, with Warhol, like this was someone who got him, who appreciated him for who he was, who liked the fact that his sexuality wasn't clear and understood like all the places that he was coming from and the kind of art that he was trying to make. So yeah, I think that was something I tried to convey. But he was always like, even if you continue reading about him after the Velvet Underground, Lou Reed is someone who's always searching, who's never really at ease, and he's always looking for something, looking to find himself, looking to find some deeper meaning, and that's an interesting journey.
Mm. Did you listen at all to his last album, to Lulu?
No, I did not. I think I listened to The Crow or something. This is years ago, but I am,
Raven. Yeah.
The
Yeah.
Raven. I'm a big fan of his albums from the 70s and maybe early 80s, but I don't think I really went past that. And there's some albums that I absolutely can't listen to, like Metal Machine Music or stuff like
Sure.
that. But no, I did not. Do you like
Yeah.
it? Did you like Lulu?
No, I mean, it was, I hadn't listened to it because I was like, why would I do this? It's just going to sour my feeling. But a number of young people who I know from comics fandom actually asked me for my take on it. And it was interesting because I had not really thought about Lulu as being this like nickname for Lou Reed. And it really got me thinking a lot about, and just specifically like how much of a heavy topic gender is throughout his lyrics. And it's not just a question of telling the stories or certainly mythologizing and sensationalizing the lives of trans women in his life and the lives of drag queens in his life, but that there's also stuff for him in there. And listening to Lulu, which I think I describe it as being like, it's Metallica. And so being Metallica, at some point they will improvise their way into some really good riffs. And being Lou Reed, at some point he will improvise himself into some really like heavy, intense, like gendery lyrics. But at no point in time does anything become anything vaguely resembling a song.
Right.
Because who's going to tell Lou Reed or Metallica no? But I'm glad I listened to it because it was interesting. But it just really hammered home to me that aspect because I don't know, man. He's just straight up digging into that in the words from that album in a personal, clear way that isn't being put into like third person or second person or any of that stuff so much of his earlier music is. It's actually pretty wild.
Yeah, in that sense, like you're saying, Lou Reed was way ahead of his time. Now everybody's discussing gender fluidity. And in the 60s, this was real fringe stuff. And also, I don't really cover that era because that's not covered in the book, but at some point the factory also became this kind of center for these really fringy New York characters that were a lot of gender and drag queens. And all these people would come to the factory and both Lou and Andy really enjoyed the personality, the craziness, the fun, and just these really colorful people that were not ignored by society and shunned. And now they're, I don't know, like 50, 60 years later, all of a sudden everybody's, let's put them in center stage. And back then it was real, like unheard of. And I think that's part of the whole mentality of, that's one reason that Lou Reed and Warhol really connected, because they had that punk mentality of let's bring in something that upsets people, that really like rubs them the wrong way. And society was so much more buttoned up back then that just having Warhol bringing these people in and then having people like Jackie Kennedy and like really like upper crust New York people come to over there, and just like in such a crazy mix. That's really interesting. And while doing the research, I also found out that Lou dated for years. He had a girlfriend that was transgender named Rachel. So it's really interesting.
Yeah. I think there's this complicated aspect of desire of artists to be oppositional to society and to say, like, deliberately trying to freak out the squares. And there's so many moments of the band specifically trying to freak out the squares. And then there's also people who are by nature different and outsiders and like maybe don't necessarily want to be targeted as being outsider or freak, but just are different. And so then there's this tension where it's like, are you exploiting people?
Oh yeah.
Are you making them, are you setting them up? Are you setting them up to be attacked?
Yeah, that's if you did a book just about the factory, that is one of the major questions. It's just, was Warhol using these people? Was he using Edie Sedgwick? When you look at her, she was used. They were friends, but also that she was exploited. But when you look at Warhol, it's almost like a projection of where television and movies would be today. And now you have reality TV and it's all exploitative. And I think that was part of it. He loved it. He loved E, and he loved like all these colorful characters, but he used them to make his image more enhanced and to have people find the factory and him more interesting. It's a major question. I think Lou Reed is a little more authentic, maybe in that sense, because he just wanted to document these people. So he's just, this is an interesting character. I'm interested in the fringes and I'm interested in the outsiders, and I'm going to write songs about it.
And he is one. And I feel like I'm appreciative that the narrative about how other people talk about Lou's life is no longer like he used to maybe think he was bisexual. No, he was bi. And then eventually he married a number of different women, and that doesn't mean he's not bi. And this is a story that acknowledges that this is not like a performance. There's plenty of things that are a performance, but that is not one of them. Although speaking of like performance, this book could potentially just have been so many just pages of like art of the band playing instruments on a stage, but you are making sure that you're really capturing the environment in which they are performing, and you're looking at the light and the color and then the responses from the audiences. And that's just like essential, I think, when you're doing a book about a band.
Yeah, I don't think I'll be doing another book about a band ever, probably, because I just drawing so many people, and also turns out drawing guitars is really difficult. And so I don't think I want to do it again. It's great. I'm happy. I'm super happy with the way the book came out, but it was definitely more visually and work-wise. It was more than I bargained for, because also, like you say, I take effort, everything looks authentic, and the shows look like they're shows from the era. So yeah, it's just a lot of work.
So, but how did you think about representing visual arts by other artists? Like, you have so many Warhol pieces in this book, right? Like, how are you representing his paintings and his silk screens and all of that on the page here?
I made sure for once to redraw them because I didn't want to get into any legal battles. So this is my version of Warhol's prints, which are always a copy of something else. So it's like a copy of a copy of a copy.
Yep.
But it was interesting to see his visual history, and also to find out that he actually did some art that was copies of comic book frames and comic book characters before he got really famous. And he did that, I think, around the same time Lichtenstein did his artwork, or maybe even before. But I didn't put those in there because they were not from that period. I just tried to make sure that like they were from the right period. So I don't have anything that is from, let's say, the 70s showing up in the factory in 1965. Right. That would be wrong. And other funny thing that I found is that he had one silk screen of from Dracula of Bela Lugosi, which is called The Kiss. So I was like, I have to put that in the book. So I snuck that in somewhere.
Yeah. On my second read through, I noticed that. I was like, oh, that's perfect. I actually didn't immediately put two and two together that because I had read your Bela Lugosi book when it came out. I got in a review copy and I just hadn't processed that. Oh, this is the same person who did it actually. So it was just interesting because I think that it certainly would appeal to a similar readership.
There's a lot of funny crossover moments where I'm sure you've seen the pictures of Andy Warhol and Nico as Batman and Robin. There's other stuff. There's a lot of, I know that Warhol liked Dracula. His nickname was Drella, which is a Dracula and Cinderella together, because supposedly he was drinking the blood of his, or just kind of like almost energy vampire, whatever you would call it. So yeah, there's a lot of like funny little crossover moments.
I actually should just ask a little bit. Tell me about some of the genesis of the Bela Lugosi book for you.
That book was, again, the Twilight Man, the book about Rod Serling did well for the publisher, and they said, who's the next subject matter? And I was already in that kind of mind frame of Hollywood, film and TV, and I was like, why don't I pivot to another kind of Hollywood star, but someone who is different, is famous for other reasons, but in kind of that general same sphere of fantasy and horror as Rod Serling was, and he was perfect. I had the story in the back of my head that I listened to a podcast about his life story years before I pitched the book, and I was like, he'd be a good subject. And so I reread his Wikipedia, and I was like, that this would be great. And so that's what happened.
I loved getting all of his pre-Hollywood history and his union activism.
Yeah, it's surprising because later in life, he didn't seem like someone who was very concerned with like social causes. But when he was, young in Hungary, he was upset with the status quo and with this very rigid and old system, especially if you're an actor where you have to work for years and years and years to rise up in the ranks. And he wasn't that kind of person. He needed the success now. And that's, again, you see this other character who's maybe restless, who, leaves Hungary, ends up fleeing Hungary, then moves to Germany, and then eventually moves to the US to try and succeed.
Yeah, I think sometimes, like, once your heart gets broken by an organizing campaign, some people, they're like, okay, and now I'm going to keep organizing. And other people, like, their heart's broken and they're just never going to do it again.
Right. Yeah. It didn't work out the way that he wanted, where the socialists there ended up being persecuted and executed, and everything went a really bad way. And so maybe he realized that he doesn't want to risk his life again or do any of that stuff. And maybe it's better he didn't, because it ended up this was a little after his heyday, but there was the whole McCarthy era where people were blacklisted, and that could have been him, but his career just waned regardless.
Anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But he's not somebody who I feel like people really heroized at all. And it's probably because of his drug addiction and the complications around was later in life, but it's sad because he really did some incredible, brave things.
Yes, definitely.
He was a really good Dracula.
He was. Yeah.
I'm looking at this. So are you predominantly interested in doing additional biographical stories moving forward, or?
They seem to be something people are interested in reading, and I enjoy making them. So I'm definitely up for making more of these, but I also want to keep doing, it's been a long hiatus of me doing fiction, which I haven't done in maybe 4 or 5 years. And so I want to get back to that as well and see where that leads. One feeds the other. And so that's something that's nice, that the things I learned from my nonfiction projects definitely contribute to the fiction projects. So you might find like a character in one of my next books that is like fiction, but sounds a lot like Lou Reed or something like that, because I could take inspiration from real people.
Hmm. Do you feel closer to the people in the story now that you've finished it, or do you feel like you need more space from them?
Definitely need more space after every one of those projects, and I need a break because you go real deep, and then you're just like, I can't. It's almost like a buffet, and you just have gorged yourself on every fact that you can find, and then now you're done, you're full. So I'm still listening to the music, and I'm still gonna love the music. But if you ask me to read another Lou Reed or John Cale biography, I'd probably skip it because I'm done.
But I also just mean like from the sense of like how you feel towards them as subjects that you've delved into so much.
Yeah, definitely feel like almost like someone I know because I read so much about these people, and I feel like I know them, but even though I've never talked to any of them, so it's a strange feeling. It's almost like being a stalker, where you're just like, follow this person, listen to what they say, see how they interact with other people, but they don't know about your own existence.
Hmm. Do you feel like this book would have been possible to do before Lou's death?
Yeah, why not? I don't think he would have disagreed with things in the book. I don't think he was too concerned with appearing as like someone who's really noble, or he
Yeah.
wasn't concerned with the cultivating a picture of himself as some amazing human being. But who knows? It's easier definitely to do it after the people pass away.
Because other people are more likely to share things, is really, I think. But also,
Oh,
like, there isn't anything else that's going to happen.
yeah, I focus on a period that's in the 60s, so that would have been already in the past. But from a legal perspective, I feel like publishers are more likely to take on a book about someone who's deceased because legally it's just a lot safer. I think you can't really defame someone who's dead. But just the same, I make sure that everything is based on research and everything is backed up, and there's nothing that I make up other than some of the dialogue. Of course, it's like speculative, but I haven't created events or moments that never existed.
Sure. But actually, that was something I was thinking about because there's bits of dialogue, like, for example, with Warhol, because we have so much documented from him talking in casual conversation because of the nature of his art. But when you have particular, like, there'll be like a dig in the script. I can't remember if it's Sterling. Sterling, I think, says to John when he's feeling Lou and Andy have become their own separate little world. He says, Lou and Andy should start their own band, the Sensational Sociopaths. And it's, yeah, is that kind of level of detail? Like when you're writing those words, which couldn't possibly be documented because nobody is like capturing that level of minor banter. Like, how do you come up with what is the appropriate way to voice somebody in a casual moment?
I think, yeah, when you read enough interviews and enough information about a person, you can start to take a guess about what their attitude would have been. And I had a scene where, towards the end, where John Cale meets Lou Reed after a long time that they haven't spoken. And John Cale says, Lou, I haven't seen you in a long time. You don't answer my calls. And then Lou Reed says, my answering machine's broken. So that's the kind of answer that I think could imagine him saying, because he had an attitude and also he had a little bit of this dark sense of humor. So I just tried to come up with something that would be true to the character.
I'm glad you did it with working on songs for Drella and them coming together and then splitting apart again. It's if you can't include everything, it feels like it's a reasonably good place to conclude that particular story.
Yeah, there's too much to include. So you have to pick and choose, especially when it's comics.
Mm-hmm. Are there any darlings that you had to kill that you wish there could be in like an expanded edition someday or something like that?
There's lots of stories, but you just can't put them all. When I was listening or reading about the recording of Drella, there were like all these moments where I think John Cale was saying that Lou Reed would smoke cigarettes and just blow the smoke in John's face, and because maybe like John was trying to quit cigarettes or something like that, and all that stuff is just, it's just, I wish I could have put that in, but I can't do a 400-page comic, and I don't think anyone's interested in reading that. So yeah, there's little moments, but I think the moments that were very important and crucial, I got them in.
Yeah, no, it's a great way to tell the story. I should ask, what kind of stuff do you teach at SVA?
I teach illustration. So I teach third-year students like the essentials of illustration, because I'm also an illustrator. So, and it's nice because it's easier. Definitely from what I've heard, it's easier than teaching comics.
It's just a really different thing to be working on as well, to be teaching while also making your own work like that too. That is a point of SVA, right? SVA is, no, we're going to have working artists teach this stuff.
Yeah, that's the idea. And so you have most of the teachers are just teaching one or two classes because they have their projects to work on. But there's still some real big names teaching there. I think David Mazzucchelli still teaches there. And so, yeah.
I appreciated the bibliography and filmography in the end. Lots of stuff I recognized. I saw Nico Icon when it came out in the theaters, actually, which I guess in some ways was a good preparation for reading this book, because it is not an idealized portrait of her at all. I don't really think it quite actually goes as far as it needed to in terms of covering some of the problems, but it certainly made it clear that this is a person who's made some not so great things in their life. But I was good to see that movie get a call out in the filmography. Mm-hmm. What was your starting point for the research? What was your starting point for the research on this?
I think just the biographies. So that's usually where I start. So with the Lou Reed biographies, and then with John Cale's autobiography, those were the starting points. And and then you go from there.
So tell our listeners where they can keep up with your work.
Yeah, you just put in my name, Koren Shadmi. I think my most active account is probably Instagram these days, but you can find me also a little bit on Twitter or X or whatever it's called. And
we will only call it Twitter here because fuck Elon Musk.
Yeah, it's awful. And those are probably the most active places.
Thanks so much for joining us. And to our listeners, thank you for supporting Graphic Policy Radio. You can always check in with me I'm on Blue Sky a lot now. My handle is Levin. That's Levin, like my last name. I'm still on the other site, Twitter some, but less than I used to be, ELANA_Brooklyn. We have more comics coverage coming your way as always. And thank you for joining me on the show. And as we like to say, keep it geeky.
Hey, thanks for watching the previous video from Graphic Policy Television. Just by watching, you help support our site. Thank you so much. Now, if you're watching these videos, you probably care about geeky things like movies, television, comic books, toys, games, video games, you name it. You can go and subscribe right now to our YouTube channel to stay in touch and catch all the new videos, or check out our website at graphicpolicy.com. There's a nice link on this end of the video. But as always, thank you for watching. Keep on rocking and keep it geeky.